I was the one who told Alaric Vane, the man half of Nettlecombe still called the Frost Duke behind his hand, that he ought to marry a stranger by Michaelmas. I have never been prouder of a piece of bad advice. We were in his study when I said it, the fire down to embers because he never rang for more coal until his fingers went stiff on the pen, and he was reading, for the 4th time, a letter from his aunt the Dowager Marchioness of Esk informing him that she had found him, at last, a suitable bride, a Miss Priscilla Otterburn, 19 years old, biddable, well-dowered, and eager. Alaric set the letter down as a man sets down something that has bitten him. "I would rather," he said, "marry the first woman who walks through that door." I did not know, when I laughed at that a woman was at that very hour walking through a door not 4 streets from his London solicitor's office, and that within the fortnight she would be walking through his. I should say, before I go further, who I am, since I mean to tell this whole account plainly and not hide behind the fashion of pretending a story tells itself. My name is Thomas Aldous Fenn. I have known Alaric Vane since we were boys thrashing each other with wooden swords in the long gallery at Nettlecombe, and I have loved him, in the plain, unashamed way one man may love a friend, for the whole of my life since. I watched him become a duke too young, at 24, when his father's heart gave out over dinner. I watched him become, in the 10 years after, a man half of London feared and none of London understood. They called him cold. I knew him merely careful, a man who had learned, early and hard, that warmth was a currency other people liked to counterfeit and spend against him. What follows is his marriage, and I was near enough to it, start to finish, to swear to every word. The letter that started it, though he did not yet know it was starting anything, reached him 3 days after the one from his aunt. It came from his solicitor, a dry, capable man named Mr. Pycroft, requesting the Duke's presence at his chambers on a small matter of an estate boundary abutting Nettlecombe land, left over from an old dispute with a neighboring parish. Alaric asked me to come along, since I had a head for surveys, and he did not care to spend an afternoon alone with lawyers if he could spend it with a friend instead. We arrived to find Mr. Pycroft's outer room already occupied. She was standing at the window with a folded paper in her hand, and I noticed first, because I notice cloth, my mother having been a mantua maker before she married above her station, and never once let me forget the value of a good seam, that her gray dress was plain, unfashionable, and better made than anything in the room. Every line of it sat true. She had made it herself. I would have staked money on it. She turned when we came in, and I saw a face that was not, by the measure society uses, a beauty, too much bone in it, too much watchfulness in the eyes, but was, I thought even then, a face a man could look at for 40 years and never once grow tired of finding something new. Alaric, beside me, went very still, in the particular way he had of going still before something he meant to master. "Your Grace," Mr. Pycroft came bustling out, flustered in a way I had never seen him, papers sliding from under his arm. "Forgive me, I did not expect. This is Miss Eleanor Thorne. Her business and yours have collided most awkwardly this morning, and I confess I do not know which of you to attend to first." "Attend to the lady," Alaric said. "My boundary dispute has waited 11 years. It can wait until after luncheon." I had known him 30 years, and I had never once heard him surrender precedence to anyone, let alone a stranger in a plain gray dress. I filed the fact away, the way one files away the first small crack in a wall one has always assumed was solid stone. Miss Thorne did not thank him prettily, the way most young women thanked a duke, all lowered lashes and trembling gratitude. She looked at him a moment as though weighing whether the offer was sincere, and then said, "I would rather not be attended to at all, sir. I would rather be told plainly what my situation is, since Mr. Pycroft has spent the last quarter hour being kind to me instead of useful." Mr. Pycroft went the color of his own ledgers. Alaric, in this I will remember on my own deathbed, laughed, not the polite exhale he gave at routs to prove he had heard the joke, an actual laugh startled out of him. "Then let us have the useful part," he said, and sat, uninvited, in the chair nearest the fire, as if he meant to stay for it. I took the other, since it seemed the office of a friend to look as though this were the most natural thing in the world. It was Mr. Pycroft, prompted twice, who finally laid the matter out. Miss Eleanor Thorne kept a dress shop and cottage in the market town of Aldercombe, left to her by her late aunt, a widow named Mrs. Honoria Thorne, who had run the shop 30 years and trained her niece to the needle from the age of 9. The aunt had died the previous winter, and her will drawn, Mr. Pycroft admitted with some embarrassment, at the urging of a nephew-in-law who fancied the property for himself, stipulated that the shop and cottage would pass to Eleanor only if she married within 8 months of the reading of the will. This being, the aunt had apparently believed in her last illness, the surest way to see her niece settled and safe, rather than alone and prey to every idle cousin with a claim. Failing marriage within the term, the whole estate, shop, stock, cottage, the modest annuity that came with it, would pass instead to a cousin by marriage, one Mr. Josiah Craik, who had made no secret in the 5 months since of how eagerly he was counting the calendar. 5 months gone, Miss Thorne said, when Mr. Pycroft faltered on the number, and 3 remaining. I came today to ask whether there is any way round the marrying, a lawsuit, an appeal, anything a solicitor's cleverness might find that a needlewoman's plain sense cannot. There is not, said Mr. Pycroft unhappily. The will is exact. I have read it 11 ways. Then I have 3 months to find a husband, she said, in the tone of a woman reciting a shopping list, or 3 months to lose the only trade I know and the only roof that is mine, to a man who has told my seamstress girl to her face that he means to let the shop to a tobacconist the week the deed changes hands. I watched Alaric's jaw work, once, the way it did when he was turning a thought over and did not yet trust it enough to speak it. You do not want a husband, he said finally. It was not a question. I want my aunt's shop, she said. I have never in my life wanted a husband less than I want him now, precisely because I am obliged to find one. I do not doubt there are women who would delight in 3 months to catch a man on any terms. I am not one of them. I would rather sew shrouds for a living than marry a fool who thinks he has caught a helpless woman and a shop besides. And if the man in question wanted neither a wife's devotion nor her shop, Alaric said slowly, but merely an arrangement, a convenience, freely struck, honestly named for what it was. I have turned that sentence over 1,000 times since, trying to decide whether he knew, in the very moment he said it, that he was proposing marriage to a woman he had met 11 minutes before. I do not think he knew it. I think the words arrived in his mouth before his sense had caught up to stop them, the way a man's hand goes up to catch a falling glass before he has decided to move at all. Miss Thorne looked at him for a long moment. Are you offering yourself as an example, your grace, or a hypothesis? I am offering myself, he said, as a man who has, this week, been informed by his aunt that he will marry a Miss Otterburn of 19 whether he wishes it or not, unless he can produce a wife of his own choosing first. I do not want a wife's devotion either, Miss Thorne. I have had enough of women who want my title and precious little of the man wearing it. I want quiet. I want my relations silenced. I would settle your shop on you by contract before the wedding, so that no one, not a cousin, not a duchess, not I myself, could ever take it from you, married or not. In exchange, I would ask only that you stand beside me at whatever dull functions duty requires, and otherwise leave each other entirely be. I believe Mr. Pycroft sat down rather suddenly. Miss Thorne did not. She studied Alaric the way I have seen her since, study a bolt of cloth before she will let herself decide it is fine enough to cut, turning it in the light, hunting the flaw. You are in earnest. I am the least playful man in England, Alaric said. Ask Fenn. He is, I said. It is rather his whole personality. That one from her, the ghost of a smile, there and gone so fast I might have invented it. Then I will think on it, she said, and write to Mr. Pycroft within the week. I did not come to London to be swept off my feet, Your Grace, and I do not intend to start now merely because the offer is unusually large. I would think less of you if you did, Alaric said, and stood, and bowed to her as though she were already a duchess, and we left Mr. Pycroft to his boundary papers, which, in the event, we never did discuss that day at all. In the carriage he was silent so long I thought he had forgotten I was in it. "You will marry a woman you spoke to for a quarter of an hour," I said at last, "because your aunt annoyed you." "I will marry a woman," he said, "who told a duke to his face that she'd rather sew shrouds than flatter him." Tell me honestly, Finn, when did a woman last say an unflattering true thing to me in that room, instead of a flattering false one? I could not, in fact, remember. I had watched women arrange themselves around Alaric Vane for a decade the way moths arrange themselves around a lamp, and I had watched him grow colder and more careful with every season of it, until the coldness itself became the only shield he trusted. I did not say any of that in the carriage. I only said, "Write to her yourself. Don't hide behind Pycroft." And he looked at me as though I had suggested something faintly indecent, and then, 3 days later, did exactly that. She did not answer him that same day. I know this because Alaric, unable to settle to anything for the better part of a week, told me so at least 4 times, each time with the studied carelessness of a man pretending he was not counting the hours. What passed between them instead was a short, brisk correspondence, 3 letters each, which Alaric kept afterward in a drawer of his desk, and which I was permitted to read only years later, when the marriage was long since proved and he no longer minded my knowing how it had truly begun. Her first letter asked him 4 questions, numbered plainly as an inventory: whether he intended to interfere in the running of her shop, whether he expected her at Nettlecombe the whole year round, or would tolerate her keeping a room above the shop for the season she wished to sow, whether any children of the marriage would inherit her aunt's property separately from the entail, so that the shop could never be swallowed into vain land and lost to a future duke's convenience, and whether he understood that she would not pretend to feelings she did not have, for any audience, ever, even his own relations. Alaric answered each in turn, in a hand I am told grew steadily less careful as the letter went on. No, whichever she preferred, and gladly. Yes, and he would have Pycroft settle it in writing before either of them signed anything else, and that he would think considerably less of her if she performed a single false feeling on his account, having had a lifetime's surfeit of performed feeling from everyone else he had ever met. Her second letter was shorter. It said only that she found his answers unusually honest for a duke, and asked whether he snored, since she intended, if they married, to keep separate rooms, and wished to know whether the precaution was strictly necessary or merely prudent. He wrote back that he had no notion, no one having been near enough to him in a decade to report it, and that he supposed she would discover the truth eventually and could inform him of the verdict. I am told this was the letter that made her laugh aloud at her own kitchen table, alone, for the first time since her aunt's funeral, though she did not tell me this herself. Her old parish's postmistress told my own sister years afterward, gossip in a small town outliving every principal party's discretion. Her third letter said simply that she would come to Aldercombe's own church to be married, not London's, and that she would meet him there in 3 weeks' time if he had not, by then, thought better of the whole scheme. He had not. He wrote back a single line, "I have seen it." I copied it once into my own commonplace book, thinking even then that I was watching something worth remembering, which read, "I find, Miss Thorne, that I think better of it daily, and worse of every arrangement I very nearly settled for instead." She said yes within the fortnight, not to him precisely, but to the arrangement, which she made Mr. Pycroft draw up in language so careful it might have satisfied a bishop. The shop and cottage were to be settled on her outright, in her own name, regardless of the marriage's future course. She would keep her trade if she wished it. Neither party would make demands of affection upon the other. It was, Mr. Pycroft told me afterward with the particular relish of a man who loves a well-drawn document, the coldest contract of marriage he had drafted in 30 years of practice, and he had drafted a great many. I went down to Aldercombe with Alaric a week before the wedding, ostensibly to inspect the church, in truth because he would not go alone and would not admit it. The town was small and neat, the kind of place where every third person seemed to be somebody's aunt. Eleanor Thorne's shop stood on the high street between a chandler's and a bakehouse, a narrow front with a bow window, and behind the glass on a stand, a half-finished gown of pale blue silk, pinned but not yet sewn at one seam, catching the afternoon light like something alive. She was at her table when the bell above the door announced us, a length of the same blue silk across her knees, needle moving so fast and sure I could not follow it. She did not rise at once, finished the seam first, which told me a great deal about the order of things in her private accounting, and only then set the work aside and stood. "Your Grace, Mr. Fenn." She had remembered my name from a single introduction. I liked her for it immediately. "You have come to see whether I keep an honest shop before you commit your name to it." "I have come," Alaric said, "because Fenn insisted I inspect a church roof I have no intention of caring about, and because I wish to see where my wife works before I marry her, since it seems the sort of thing a husband ought to know, even a husband in name." "Then you shall have the tour," she said, and gave it brisk, unsentimental, pointing out the bolts of cloth by quality and origin, the little back room where she cut patterns, the cottage beyond with its 2 rooms and its kitchen garden gone to seed since her aunt's death, because she had not the hours to keep both shop and garden alive. I watched Alaric's eyes move over all of it, not the polite, dismissive glance of a man being shown a servant's quarters, but the attention he gave to estate ledgers, to things he meant to actually understand. "You made that yourself," he nodded at the blue silk gown in the window. "The gown." "I make everything myself, Your Grace. That is rather the definition of a dressmaker." "I did not ask to be corrected on the meaning of your own trade," he said, though without heat. "I asked because it is very fine work, and I know enough of fine work to recognize it, my mother having been particular about such things, and I find myself curious who it is for." Something crossed her face then, not quite a blush, more a private flicker of surprise that he had noticed at all. "No one yet." "I cut it from a pattern of my own devising, on an evening when I did not want to think about wills and cousins and solicitors. Sometimes I make a thing simply because my hands need the work and my mind needs the rest it gives them." "I understand that entirely," Alaric said, and I thought, there it is, the first true thing they have told each other that has nothing to do with contracts. We stayed an hour longer than any inspection of a church roof required. On the ride back to the inn where we were lodged, Alaric did not speak of walls or windows at all. He spoke of the gown, of the particular blue, of how she had not once, in an hour of showing a duke her livelihood, apologized for its smallness. "She is not humble," he said, as though working out a puzzle. "She is merely unimpressed." It is not the same thing at all, and I find I have almost no experience of the second. The wedding, 3 weeks later, was as plain as either of them could make it against the objections of half his family. It took place in the small stone church at Aldercombe rather than in London, which scandalized his aunt considerably, and which I privately thought the wisest decision Alaric had made in a decade. Eleanor wore the blue silk gown from the shop window, finished now, the seam that had been pinned that first afternoon sewn true and invisible. She looked, standing in the low winter light through the church's narrow windows, like a woman who had made her own dignity with her own 2 hands, which in the most literal sense she had. I stood up with Alaric as his groomsman, as I had always known I would, whatever woman eventually stood on the other side of him. When the vicar asked whether any man knew cause why they should not be joined, I confess my heart gave one absurd lurch, waiting for Josiah Craik to burst through the door as villains do in the stories my sisters used to read aloud. He did not. He was, I later learned, in Aldercombe that very hour, having driven up specially to make some manner of scene, and had been quietly turned back at the church door by Mr. Pycroft, who had anticipated him and stationed himself there with the settled deed already in hand, ready to be shown to anyone fool enough to dispute it. Craik left, I am told, white with fury and entirely without recourse, and I do not believe either Alaric or Eleanor spared him another thought that day, which was, I think, the sweetest revenge available to either of them, not his humbling, but their indifference to him. They did not kiss at the altar the way young lovers do. They looked at each other with the particular gravity of two people who have just signed the most consequential document of their lives and mean to honor every word of it. I thought, watching them, that I had never seen two people begin a marriage with less romance and more respect, and I did not yet understand that respect, given time and proximity, and two people willing to be honest, is very often romance's own patient grandfather. Nettlecombe, when Eleanor arrived there as its new mistress, was not what she had been led by Alaric's own careless description of it as large and cold and none of my concern, to expect. It was grand, certainly. 300 years of vain dukes had seen to that. But it was also, unmistakably, neglected in the particular way of a house whose master has stopped believing anyone will ever truly live in it. Dust sheets over furniture in rooms no one used. A ballroom whose chandelier had not been lit in years. Gardens clipped for appearance from the drive, but gone wild, everywhere the eye of a casual visitor would not reach. I watched her walk through it that first week, with the same assessing eye she had given the bolts of cloth in her own shop, not disdainful, but cataloguing, deciding what could be mended and what must simply be accepted. "It wants living in," she said to me the second evening when Alaric had been called away to his steward and I had stayed behind at her quiet invitation to share the last of the tea. "Not redecorating, living in. There is a difference, and I think your friend has forgotten it." "He has had no one to live in it with," I said, before I quite decided whether it was mine to say. She turned her cup in her hands. "I am aware, Mr. Fenn, that this is a marriage of convenience and not of feeling. You need not soften the truth of his loneliness to spare mine. I am not fool enough to have expected a love match. I expected a fair bargain, honestly kept, and so far he has kept it more scrupulously than I dared hope." "That is not quite the same as being content with it," I said. She did not answer that directly. She only looked for a moment toward the window, where the last light was going gold over the unweeded rose garden, and said, "No, I suppose it is not," and then asked me, with a briskness that closed the subject as firmly as a shop door, whether I took milk in my tea, though she had poured it for me 3 evenings running and knew perfectly well that I did. I want to be honest in this account and say that the deepening between them, when it came slowly, and in small things, the way frost comes to a window, not all at once, but gathering, pane by pane, until one morning you look and the whole glass is covered in some pattern too fine to have been drawn on purpose. I ought to explain, too, why Alaric had wanted quiet so badly in the first place, since a man does not go looking for a stranger to marry without some private reckoning behind it, and his was this. For 3 years his steward, a decent but overcautious man named Hollies, had been urging him to modernize the tenant cottages along the Nettlecombe home farm, to drain the low fields that flooded every spring and cost 2 families their harvest, and to do it all before the roofs gave out entirely. And for 3 years Alaric had put off the expense, not from meanness, but because every improvement scheme brought his aunt's faction circling with talk of how a settled, married duke managed his affairs so much more soundly than a bachelor one, until the estate's welfare and his own bachelorhood had become tangled in his mind as 2 halves of a single argument he was tired of losing. He had told me once, in a rare unguarded hour, that he sometimes felt Nettlecombe itself was waiting on him to marry before it would let him mend it, as though the house and the 800 souls who depended on it were all holding their breath alongside his relations. It was a foolish way to feel, and he knew it was foolish even as he felt it, But a man raised from the cradle to believe his private life was a public asset does not easily unlearn the habit of thinking his loneliness a matter of estate business. Marrying to silence his aunt was, in the end, only the surface of it. Underneath, I believe he married because he could no longer bear to watch Holly's cottages go another winter unmended, while he waited for a feeling he had stopped believing he was capable of. Eleanor discovered this before I ever told her, which did not surprise me, since she had a seamstress's habit of finding the seam in a thing others thought whole. She had been at Nettlecombe scarcely 6 weeks when she asked Alaric. Over a dinner the two of them mostly took in companionable silence, why the cottages along the home farm had sagging thatch when the house itself wanted for nothing. "Holly's will tell you it is a matter of masons and money," Alaric said, "and he will not be wrong, but he will not be telling you the whole of it either." "Then tell me the whole of it," Eleanor said, "since I understood when I signed Mr. Pycroft's contract that I was marrying an estate as much as a man, and I should like to know what sort of estate I have married." He told her the flooding fields, the 3 years of delay, the aunt's faction and their tiresome arithmetic of marriage incompetence, and I watched her listen the way she listened to everything, without flattery and without alarm, simply taking the measure of the cloth. "Then let us mend it," she said, when he had finished, "and let your aunt make of the timing whatever she likes. I did not marry you to watch you flinch from your own tenants for fear of what London says of your bachelor accounts." It was, I think, the first time anyone had ever spoken to Alaric Vane about his own estate as though it were a shared burden rather than either his private failing or his private glory, and he did not quite know what to do with the sensation. He mended the cottages that spring, drained the low fields, re-roofed the worst of the row along the home farm, and did it, at Eleanor's quiet insistence, with local masons and local thatchers rather than the London men his aunt would have preferred, so that the money stayed in Aldercombe and the work was done by hands that had a stake in doing it well. Eleanor herself went down twice a week that whole spring to see the tenant wives fitted for new linens, since she said plainly she would not have families moved into mended cottages with nothing decent to put in the cupboards, and I do not believe there was a soul on that estate by summer who did not know the new Duchess by name and by kindness, which was more, I confess, than could be said of any Duchess Nettlecombe had known in my lifetime. It began, I think, with the mending. Eleanor could not sit idle, it was not in her nature, whatever the size of the house around her, and within a month of her arrival she had quietly taken over the household's mending, not because any duchess ought to darn linens with her own hands, but because, she told the housekeeper with perfect frankness, she found the estate's needlework shoddy, and it offended her professional pride to live among crooked hems. Alaric found her one evening in the small parlor off the library, a mountain of curtains from the unused east rooms across her lap, working by candlelight with the same fast, sure needle I had seen that first day in the shop window. He did not ask her to stop, though I think another man in his place might have, embarrassed to see his duchess at labor. He sat instead, uninvited, in the chair across from her, and after a silence said, "You needn't do this. There are seamstresses enough on the estate payroll." "They are not very good," Eleanor said, without looking up. "No offense to them, they were never trained properly, only set to it because a girl must do something. I like the work. It settles my mind, as I told you once. You have given me a very large house and very little to occupy it. This occupies it." "Then let me give you something better to occupy it with," he said, and I did not hear the rest of that conversation, for I was not there. Eleanor told me of it herself, weeks later, over tea, with the particular wry amusement she brought to nearly everything. But the upshot of it was that Alaric proposed, and made good within the month, on turning one of the disused rooms of Nettlecombe into a proper workroom for her. Good light, good tables, a standing order with the finest cloth merchants in London, and this the detail that undid her, she admitted to me, more than the room or the cloth, a standing invitation to any woman on the estate or in the village who wished to learn the needle properly to come and be taught by the Duchess herself, at wages. 3 afternoons a week. He remembered, she said to me, turning her cup exactly as she had that first evening, that I said my aunt trained me from 9 years old and that I was proud of it. I mentioned it once in passing weeks before. I did not think he was attending. Husbands in these arrangements are not generally meant to attend. He attends to everything, I said. He always has. It is rather his whole personality, if you will permit me borrowing your own word for it. She laughed at that, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind I had not yet heard from her in all the months of her residence at Nettlecombe, and said, I begin to think the two of you have conspired to make a fool of me with my own sentences. And I thought, watching her laugh, that I was witnessing something neither of them had bargained for in Mr. Pycroft's careful contract, and that neither of them yet had the courage to name it. The workroom became, over that autumn, the true heart of the house, more than the drawing room, more than the library where Alaric had always taken his solitary evenings. He began to find reasons to sit there of an evening, a letter to read, a ledger to check, work that could as easily have been done anywhere in the house but was, increasingly, only ever done in the one room where Eleanor sat with her needle and her lamp. She never asked him why he came. I think she knew by then exactly why, and found she did not mind the knowing. There was, in that same autumn, one visit I have never forgotten, though it lasted scarcely 2 days and left no mark on the household's history beyond the memory of those who witnessed it. The Dowager Marchioness of Esk, Alaric's aunt and the very architect of the Miss Otterburn scheme he had married so precipitously to escape, descended upon Nettlecombe unannounced, ostensibly to make the acquaintance of her new niece, in truth to satisfy herself that the rumors reaching London, a duke married in 3 weeks to a tradeswoman from a market town, were not quite so scandalous as they sounded. She was a formidable woman, the Marchioness, given to examining a person the way a magistrate examines evidence, and she began, over the first evening's dinner, by asking Eleanor with pointed sweetness whether she found the transition from shopkeeping to duchessing very taxing to her nerves. Not especially, my lady, Eleanor said, unruffled. I have kept accounts, managed difficult customers, and stood on my feet 12 hours a day since I was 9 years old. I find duchessing considerably less taxing than a Tuesday in December with every woman in Aldercombe wanting her Christmas gown finished at once. The Marchioness's mouth thinned, but I saw, too, the flicker of something like respect cross her face, quickly suppressed. It was the second evening that mattered more. The Marchioness, having drunk rather more claret than was her custom, remarked lightly, as though it cost her nothing, that she supposed Eleanor was grateful, at least, to have escaped a life of common trade for a duchess's ease. Eleanor set down her own glass with great care. I am not grateful to have escaped anything, my lady, she said. I am glad of my marriage and glad of my husband, but I have not escaped my trade. I have simply added a second occupation to the first, and I do not rank a needle beneath a coronet, whatever your ladyship has been taught to believe of the two. My aunt built that shop from nothing with her own hands and buried a husband and 2 children doing it, and I will not sit at this table and hear her life's work called something I ought to be glad to have left behind. The Marchioness said nothing further on the subject that night, and I saw Alaric's hand find Eleanor's beneath the tablecloth, out of sight of the footmen, and hold it there the length of the whole remaining course. The Marchioness left 2 days later than planned, and wrote to Alaric within the month to say she had misjudged the marriage, and more grudgingly, to say she had misjudged the woman in it. A letter Eleanor kept, I am told, tucked inside the very first letter Alaric had ever sent her, as though the two belonged together in the ledger of her own private accounting of what had been won. It was in that room, on an evening in late November with the first hard frost silvering the windows, that I saw the thing turn from gathering into declared, though it was declared, in the end, in the smallest possible words. I had come to dine, as I often did that season, Alaric's oldest friend having become, by slow and pleasant degrees, something like a fixture of the household. After dinner Alina withdrew to her workroom as was her habit, and Alaric, instead of returning to the library as had been his habit for 10 years before her, followed her, and I followed them both, curious and unashamed of it, and stood a moment in the doorway before either noticed me. She was working on a length of deep green wool, a coat, I later learned, meant for a boy in the village whose own had gone to rags before winter, made and given without any fanfare. One of a dozen such quiet kindnesses I only discovered by accident over the years, because she never once mentioned them herself. Alaric stood behind her chair, not touching her, watching her hands move. "You have not asked me," he said, "why I never remarried after my father died, though everyone else in England has asked it for a decade." "I assumed," Alina said, not pausing her needle, "that it was because you disliked being asked things and would tell me if you ever wished to." "I disliked," he said, "watching women look at me and see a title. My mother taught me to shake hands and take supper and dance a passable quadrille before she taught me to read, because she believed, and she was not wrong, that I would need those things more than Latin, being born to inherit what I was born to inherit. I have spent 34 years being looked at as an inheritance with a face attached. You are the first person in that entire span who came into a room, looked at me, and saw a man offering a fair bargain and judged the bargain on its own honest terms. I did not know, until you did it, how much I had wanted to be looked at that way. I am telling you this badly. Fen would tell you I tell everything badly that matters most." "You are telling me," she said, and here her needle did at last go still, "quite well enough." "I did not marry you for quiet in the end," Alaric said. "I told myself I had, at Pyecroft's chambers, because it was easier to want a fair bargain than to admit, on 11 minutes' acquaintance, that I wanted the woman driving it. But it has not been 11 minutes for some months now, Alina, and I find the wanting has not lessened with acquaintance. It has only grown particular. I do not ask anything of you that our contract did not already promise. I only find I can no longer, in honesty, pretend the wanting is not there. I ought, at this point in any properly told story, to have withdrawn from the doorway and left them their privacy. And I did withdraw, a moment later, far enough that I heard no more of what passed between them in words. But I confess, I watched one moment longer than decency strictly allowed, because I had waited 10 years to see it. Alina Thorne set down her needle entirely, turned in her chair, and looked up at Alaric Vane with an expression I had never once, in all my years of knowing him, seen aimed at him by anyone, not admiration, not calculation, not even simple affection, but a kind of plain, startled recognition, as though she had just realized she was looking at exactly the thing she had stopped believing she would ever be permitted to want. She did not speak. She reached up and took his hand, the one nearest her shoulder, and held it, and that was all, and it was, I thought, retreating at last down the darkened corridor with my own foolish eyes stinging, entirely enough. I would like to say that from that evening forward all was smooth water, but I have promised to tell this honestly, and honesty requires me to record the one difficulty that still stood between them, which was not a want of feeling but a want of nerve. For having admitted, each to the other, that the bargain had become something warmer, neither seemed entirely able to say the plainest word of all, the one that would turn warmth into vow. Alaric, I think, feared that to press her further would be to break the very freedom the contract had promised her, the freedom she had bought so dearly with a needle and a stubborn independence, and he would rather have gone another 10 years unspoken for than take that freedom from her by force of his own wanting. And Alina, this she told me herself, much later, laughing a little at her own foolishness, feared that to say the word first would be to admit she had wanted, all along, precisely the thing she had sworn to Mr. Pyecroft and to herself she did not want. A husband's whole heart, given not by contract but by choice. It was the will itself, in the end, or rather, its shadow, one last time crossing the threshold that forced the word out of them both. Josiah Craik, who had been sulking in London on the strength of a small income and a large grievance since the wedding, resurfaced in the new year with a fresh piece of mischief. A claim, lodged with a lawyer of his own hiring, that the marriage had been a sham from the start, contracted in bad faith solely to defeat the aunt's will, and ought therefore to be set aside, the shop and cottage reverting to him as the true and only heir the will had intended to benefit should marriage fail to occur, in good faith. It was a thin claim, and Mr. Pycroft told us within a day that it would not survive a fortnight in any court in England. But a thin claim can still summon a great deal of noise, and Craik, out of spite more than hope, had contrived to have the accusation printed in veiled terms in a London scandal sheet, so that all the world might read over its breakfast that the Frost Duke's marriage was rumored a cold contrivance and nothing more. Alina read the paper at breakfast the morning it appeared, and I watched her go very still over it, the particular stillness I had first seen in Alaric himself the day they met. "They will say," she said quietly, "that I sold my needlework for a duke's name and never loved him at all, and they will not be wholly wrong about how it began, which is the worst of it. A lie is easy to bear. A half-truth aimed at the tenderest part of you is not." Alaric took the paper from her hands, read the paragraph through once, and set it down with a calm I do not think he felt. "Then we shall answer it," he said, "not with lawyers, though Pycroft may have his say as well, but with the truth, plainly told, since plain truth has served us better than any of London's cleverness from the very first afternoon." He did not tell me beforehand what he meant to do, which was, I have come to believe, entirely deliberate on his part. He wanted no one, not even his oldest friend, to suspect the words before Alina herself heard them. What he did was this. He had cards sent to every family of consequence within 30 miles, and several from London besides, inviting them to a ball at Nettlecombe the following week. The first ball the house had seen in a decade, the chandelier in the long dark ballroom scrubbed and rehung and lit for the first time since his father's day. Half of Aldercombe assumed he meant to answer scandal with mere show, a duke's blunt instrument of chandeliers and champagne to drown out a rumor. I assumed nothing, because I had learned over 30 years that Alaric Vane's plans were never so simple as they first appeared, and I was right not to assume. The ball was, by any measure, a triumph of the ordinary sort: good music, good food. The county's gentry delighted to be received again at Nettlecombe after so long an exile from its doors. But at its center, when the dancing had paused and the room stood full and bright beneath the newly lit chandelier, Alaric did a thing no duke of my acquaintance had ever done at his own ball. He crossed the floor to where Alina stood near the long windows, not dancing, for she had never cared much for dancing, but watching the room she had, in her quiet, unassuming way, brought back to life, and he took her hand before the whole assembled company, and he did not lower his voice at all. "Some of you," he said, into a room gone curious and quiet, "have read a certain paragraph this month, printed by a man who wanted my wife's shop more than he ever wanted her happiness, suggesting that my marriage was a cold bargain and nothing besides. I will not trouble myself to answer Mr. Craik through his own lawyers, since Mr. Pycroft will answer him quite thoroughly enough. But I find I will not have it said, under my own roof, before my own neighbors, that what stands between myself and my wife is a contract and nothing more. It began as a contract. I do not deny that, and I am not ashamed of it. It was an honest bargain, honestly struck, between two people who wanted, above all else, to be dealt with fairly for once in their lives. But a bargain is not what stands between us now, and I would be a liar and a coward both to let this room go on believing it. I love my wife. I loved her before I found the courage to say it to her alone, in a small workroom with a lamp burning, months ago, and I have grown only surer of it every day since. And I would rather every person in this room know the truth of my marriage from my own mouth, than let a jealous man's half-lie stand unanswered in a newspaper. I have attended a great many astonishing scenes in 30 years at that man's side, and I have never seen a ballroom go so silent, nor seen a leaner thorn, a leaner vein, I ought to say, though I confess I thought of her by her own name still, out of old habit and old affection. Go so entirely still, her eyes bright in the candlelight, one hand at her throat as though to hold in whatever she meant to say. "You are meant to say something back," she told him at last, low enough that only those nearest heard it, though I was near enough, "or this room will think you have made a very grand speech to a wife who does not return it." "Then say it," Alaric said, "if it is true. I would rather be told the truth by you before all of England than a kindness by anyone else in private." "It is true," Elinor said, and her voice when it came was not the brisk voice of the shop or the solicitor's chambers but something softer and entirely her own. "I did not want a husband when I came to London. I wanted my aunt's shop and nothing else, and I told you so myself, quite rudely, at our very first meeting. I did not know then that a man could offer a woman a fair bargain, and having kept every word of it faithfully, go on to offer her something no contract ever demanded of him. His whole attention, his whole patience, a room full of light for her needle, and her name kept entirely safe in law whatever became of his heart or hers. I have had months now to watch you keep every promise you never had to keep, and I find, Your Grace, that I love you a good deal more than I ever intended to when I signed Mr. Pycroft's very careful document, and I do not care in the least who prints what about the manner of our beginning, since I have never in my life been so certain of anything as I am of how we have gone on." He kissed her then before the whole assembled county, which I am told was accounted, for years afterward in that neighborhood, the most romantic thing anyone had seen a vain duke do since the family portraits were painted, and the chandelier burned on above them, and somewhere in London, I have no doubt, Josiah Craik read the account of it in the very same scandal sheet that had tried to wound them, and choked on his coffee. The will's shadow troubled them no further after that night. Mr. Pycroft saw Craik's claim dismissed within the fortnight, precisely as he had promised, and I am told Craik himself, on hearing how thoroughly the ballroom declaration had turned the county's sympathy against him, left England for a cousin's holding in Ireland rather than face his neighbors at the next assembly, and was seldom spoken of at Nettlecombe again, except as a cautionary figure in Elinor's own retelling of the tale to her daughters, years later, as proof that spite makes a poor investment beside patience. The shop in Aldercombe stood, deed and all, entirely and permanently Elinor's own, though she kept it running still, by her own choice and not necessity, training girls to the needle 3 afternoons a week at Nettlecombe, and driving down to Aldercombe herself once a month to see the shop's affairs kept honest, because she had told me once that a woman ought never entirely give up the thing that had taught her her own worth, however grand the house she came to live in afterward. I dined at Nettlecombe last winter, an old man now myself, and found the ballroom chandelier still lit of an evening, out of habit more than need, and found Alaric, the Frost Duke, no longer, though I confess the old name had a certain fondness to it by then, the way an old scar can, sitting in the workroom with a lamp and a ledger he did not need to be reading there, while his wife's needle went fast and sure through a length of good wool, and their youngest daughter sat cross-legged on the floor between them, cutting scraps of ribbon into shapes with the grave concentration only the very young can bring to nonsense. "You are still sitting in her workroom of an evening," I said to him, when Elinor had gone to see the child to bed and left us a moment by the fire, "after all these years, when you have a library the size of a cathedral to sit in instead." "I have sat in that library alone for 30 years of my life, Finn," he said, "and I sit in her workroom now because it is the one place in this whole enormous house that has always, from the very first month, felt entirely and only like home. A contract brought me to that room. I do not think anything but love could have kept me in it this long, and gladly, every single evening since. I have no better way to close this account than that, since it is, in the end, the whole and simple truth of the thing. Two people struck a fair bargain to solve a hard problem, and found, in the keeping of it, that the truest marriages are very often the ones that begin as arrangements and are, slowly and honestly, turned by two patient hearts into love.